Thanks, Meg. Welcome, everybody. Um, so I'm going to talk about how the pandemic has impacted our happiness at work. We've just done a big survey of the UK, so I can compare it to pre-COVID data. Just to say a bit who I am, this is me quite a long time ago now. 10, 12 years ago when I did a TED talk. I'm a statistician by trade. And very brief bio, I did maths, statistics and systems thinking at Cambridge and Lancaster. I then in the 90s did lots of work sort of doing management consultancy, quality of life studies. I trained to be a therapist, which gives me a slightly different angle, I think, on all of the happiness work and work itself. I then in the 2000s worked in the think tank world, advising the UK government, other governments, government agencies on how to measure well-being. It was work that built up through the 2000s, which led to my TED talk. And after that, I basically concentrated on work and thinking about how to best measure happiness at work. So that's a very brief intro to me. So this is the model I'm going to base my talk on, which is that happy teams are very desirable. They're desirable for people in the teams and they're desirable for the business. And basically the model goes from left to right here, that we have drivers of making happy teams and we have successes that come out of having happy teams. And this survey will cover some of those things, not everything perfectly because it's a cross-sectional survey at one point in time. But we'll look at the drivers, the day-to-day way that people are working, team culture, and some organizational issues. So for the day-to-day, we'll look at something about habits, but particularly about friction and flow, like what holds people back, what helps them flow. The team culture, we'll look at the 5 ways to happiness at work, which is Friday Pulse's way of thinking about what the drivers are. And organizationally, we'll look a little bit about data on pay, clarity, and also organizational size, actually. And then we flip to the successes. And the successes include things like happy teams have better staff retention, attract talent more, they have lower stress, better collaboration and creativity, more productive, more resilient, and ultimately higher business value. So there's lots of goodies in here, and a cross-sectional survey can show us some things in this, but not everything. Firstly, going to go to so data in the survey. So a lot of data in the survey on connect, be fair, empower, challenge, inspire. We have some on the friction and flow and habits of people, and some on pay and clarity of role. We have some on the other end linked to staff retention, lower stress, more resilient, more productive. So the main data is going to be on staff retention and stress, but a little bit more on some other places too. So this was the survey that happened itself. So I did 60 questions in February this year. We went out to a representative sample of 1,500 UK workers. We used quotas if people are excited about the methodology, so that we ensure we had a good spread across sectors, particularly industries, different age groups, gender, and everything like that. The things that we measured in it were happiness and then also interest and stress. 18 questions on the drivers, that's on the 5 ways to happiness, basically, at work. Some on team experience, then we had some on things like intention to quit, whether you felt burnt out, whether your team was successful. And we had extra modules on hybrid working, wellbeing programs, and staff surveys. I'll touch on hybrid working and a little bit on surveys in there. There's still more data to be mined from this. But basically, let's just firstly just think about the pandemic and how has it impacted you? I mean, how was your 2020? It was an extraordinary year. It was very, very up and down. And I would imagine that it felt a bit like this, in that this is a data actually from YouGov on weekly happiness through 2020 in the UK. And we can see, the beginning part of the year, normal ups and downs, huge dip in March into April, recovery over the summer months, and then a dip again. And happiness data, when you measure it weekly, can really pick up these ups and downs of it. And it's sort of very much how people feel about it. And time trends tell stories about this. So it's a really good way of helping people connect to the data around happiness if you're an advocate of happiness. And actually, this is the data from YouGov. I just downloaded it yesterday, I think, so they have this data available. It's exactly the same data. You can see the drop in March 2020. This is the recovery over the summer. This is the dip in the autumn. And this data is great, I think, and it tells very interesting stories. So you can see the COVID lockdowns here. This is the first lockdown. This is the one in the January, February of 2021, and you see that happiness was very suppressed during those weeks. But you can also see things like Christmas peaks. So this is the Christmas before COVID, the first one when we only allowed a couple of people. I think we weren't allowed many. Can't remember what happened in 2021, and then 2022 it was a bit more open. But you can still see these peaks we get on Christmas. So people feel happier on Christmas week, which tells us the data is saying something reasonable. We can see things like the end of summer blues. We see the trail off in the autumn every year. We can see seasonal effects, basically. So the summer months are the most happy. I've taken out Christmas here, but you can see the rest of the year is lower. January tends to be the least happy month. Those are basically the seasonal effects of spring, summer, autumn, and winter. So the data is picking up things. So I think we can rely on this data. Here's just other bits, big events. That dip there is Russia invading Ukraine. That dip there is the Queen dying, the cost of living crisis. Liz Truss's very short government's in there too. But there's been this very significant drop since COVID. And the reason I'm showing you this data is that there are different ways of measuring happiness, and weekly is one of the measures and one of the very best measures, I think, of doing it. And you can see here that people, the trend is downward over that time. So, and that's important to recognize here, that's what's happening. So you've got here pre-COVID, about 50% of people in any week would say they were happy. It dropped to 40. It's now at 44%. And that's a lot lower. That's a lot lower than here. We all know that 2020 was a bad year, but we're continuing right through into 2023 with these lower levels of weekly happiness. And what that basically means when you extrapolate out to the whole UK is that there are 3 or 4 million people who we would expect to have been happy last week, but weren't. So basically, there's a lot more people who aren't able to say on a weekly basis that they were happy. We all have good and bad weeks, so that 50% won't be the same people all of the time. But there's a lot of people who are feeling less happy than they were in 2019. And I'm saying that in context because the data I have about happiness at work is slightly mixed. And I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that actually there's a lot going on here in this weekly data. So sorry, Zoom is just playing around with me. My apologies. So going back to this model, I'm going to talk through some of the data that we've got on it going on. So the first thing is to just actually how many people are saying that they're happy, that they're in a happy team at work. And we can look at the data. There's a question in the survey, which is in general, how happy are you at work? It's a very overall question. It's a catch-all question around happiness. It's called a cognitive assessment. When you measure weekly, it's called an episodal measurement. This is an overall cognitive judgment about how your work is going. And we can look 2017 versus 2023. So I have a survey you did in 2017, which I've asked exactly the same questions, same representative sample. So it's pretty comparable. It's very comparable. So we can look first at 2017. This was the distribution of happiness in 2017. This is the distribution of happiness at work in 2023. So we've got fewer people here who are saying they're very happy. We're very happy. There's more here, but you bumped these people down. There's basically more people who are okay or happy, fewer who are very happy, not much change down here at all. When you translate that all together, the difference is quite small. There was 63.4% of people who said they were happy or very happy in 2017. It's 62.7. It's not even statistically significant. It's sort of right on the margins of statistically significant. It's that small a change, which kind of took me by surprise. But I think it's because of the context being work, people are quite focused on work. So the YouGov is how happy people feel generally in life, and that's falling. So at work, it's sort of relatively stable. That doesn't mean to say that things haven't changed. And in this survey, I asked an additional question, which was how happy were you at work this week? And the reason for that is I want to create a benchmark for our clients on that, but also to see what the difference is between people thinking generally about work and about how they were specifically this week. And what you find is a graph like this. So the blue is the overall happiness score, and the sort of turquoisey one is the weekly. And you can see that basically more people are unhappy or okay on a weekly basis. It's the same people in the same survey. So they're just basically saying that, yeah, overall I'm happy at work, but last week wasn't great. It's about 20% of the people, in fact, it's on the next slide, who said they were happy now say they're not. So this is a crosstab. It's showing that 50% of people who said they had were both 50% of people had both happiness in general and a happy week. 31% unhappy week and unhappy. But at the diagonals, you've got 13% of people who basically happy generally but didn't have a great week last week. So 20% of them basically. And same here. People who are generally unhappy but had a good week is about 20% of the people that are unhappy. And what that means is we've got a little bit more variance in the weekly happiness data, which is good. It's also, I'm more confident of it because people are very specific about when they're working to it. But they're also pretty generally related. So looking at people's habits and friction and flow and how that impacts their happiness is what the first thing I want to do with the survey. So one of the ways that I measure friction is, are people stressed? They're obviously stressed or frustrated, something not going right for them. Are they interested in their work? So that's more like a flow experience. And so you can think about this. So tech teams often think about this in retrospectives. They think what's gone well at their work, what hasn't. And it's really getting into that space of like, what is driving people's weekly experience of work? And what you find here is that interest is driving, and i.e. a lack of boredom. So boredom is the opposite of interest. So is driving happiness at work much more than stress is. So if you want to negativize these, then friction, the stress is undermining happiness at work. And if you flip this around and say boredom would be 3 or 4 times as much of an impact on happiness at work as stress. And I think that's a really interesting finding. I'm finding consistently in the data that actually stress does matter, but helping people find their work interesting, enjoyable, not boring is much, much more important for people's happiness at work than stress. Too much stress is bad, for certain, but the driver of happiness is much more about interest. You can also ask people questions about their habits. So the one question I had there was about how frequently do you meet as your team? I mean, I could think about, now I'm thinking of the survey in a different way. I could think of lots of questions I could ask here. But this was one thing, was how frequently do you meet at a team? How does that impact? People often say, oh, I can't stand meetings. But actually having a good weekly team meeting is good for happiness. So this is how people respond to that question. So did they never meet as a team? Were they only once a month? Were they weekly or more? And you can see that when they were weekly, they were much more likely to have a better week than if they were meeting monthly. So the habits that go on at team levels are definitely impacting people's experience of work. We would expect that, but it's coming out strongly in the data. You can then also look at the team culture. So this is what we call the culture, and we talk about the 5 ways to happiness at work as being driving that culture. So these are the 5 ways. Connect, so about relationships, are one of the most critical ways of driving happiness at work. Being treated fairly, fairness, respect, appreciation, work-life balance, feeling empowered, challenged, and inspired. Now, because we've got a outcome measure, how happy were you at work, we can look at the impact of each of these independently on happiness at work. And in fact, this would be a critique of the Gallup Q12 for me, which is that Gallup Q12 has measures that are a bit similar to these 5 ways questions we use, but they've got no outcome measure. So they never know the impact size of them. You just have to take their words for them. Well, we can unpick that. And what you can see here, these are called beta coefficients. These are all statistically significant relationships. Every question's got a statistically significant relationship to it. But you can see here that what's driving or undermining, if it's negative, happiness at work most is being treated fairly. And the second one is feeling inspired. And those are the 2 biggest drivers of happiness at work. So being treated fairly, feeling inspired that the work you do is worthwhile. All of the rest are important, and I'll show you how they change, but they're all important. But it's sort of, it's good to sort of look at this data afresh and think about what is really driving people's experience of happiness at work. These are the 15 questions that we use. So there's team relationships, team cooperation. So underneath these scores, here's 3 questions on each of these. If you're really geeky, then they all are subscales effectively, which means they have a good Cronenberg alpha, so that they hold together as 3 questions going on there. So these are the 15 questions that we use, and we can look at their correlation coefficients that are related to happiness at work. So I picked out the major ones. So they are being treated with respect, having a good work-life balance, feeling proud of the organization you work comes out as top. It came out top in the last one too. So those are the 3 biggest drivers, but you can see the next ones too. So team relationships, appreciation, strengths use, learning, accomplishment, all of the rest will be having a relationship with happiness at work, but they also all move together. So these are the strongest ones that start coming through on them. But we can see changes in the 5 ways too. So it's just reminding you which ones are the most important and the next most important. But these are the changes that we see between the 2 years. And basically, these are the biggest positive changes, which is that people feel more appreciated at work, a big difference in how appreciated people feel at work. That's kind of surprising and kind of interesting. We can see that their ability to influence decision and better feedback is going on in organizations. So there's variables here which are improving. So the appreciation, maybe we've all just got to, to the stage with COVID where we just suddenly noticed each other much more, that we noticed how much we were supporting each other during that time. But, definitely people are feeling like they are more appreciated on a day-to-day basis than they were before COVID. The negative ones, the one that's gone down the most is work-life balance, which is interesting. I mean, I saw this variable falling very early in COVID days across our clients, and it's still the one that's fallen the most when I look at the survey here. And I think that some of the boundaries between work and life have become much more blurred. And I've got a little bit of data on remote working that's very messy. There's no clear, nothing clear coming through on remote work really. But basically, the sort of membrane between life and work, I think, has become more fuzzy, and we're seeing that in the data. And then the other ones that are falling is team cooperation. So possibly we're a bit more in silos, and these are rounded, so that's why that says -3 there, even those look like that. So there'll be decimal places behind it. Statistical significance is about 1.82% here. So some of the 2% are significant and some aren't. So basically those are the sort of changes that are going on. And when you look at it, it's in this sort of space here that the biggest changes are going, and some are positive and negative, which is probably why we haven't got a very big difference, in that there's been some things that have improved and some things that haven't. And it's coming out in that data there. But the work-life balance being down, I think, links very tightly to the YouGov data, which is the weekly data available, because it's basically, people's lives are very under pressure, and so work-life balance is under pressure too. So how we help people integrate that at work, I think, is really important. We can also then go and look at things like pay, a fair pay basically, and clarity of what's expected of you. So some of the things that are more at an organizational level. So these ones here, the team culture ones, are more happening at a team level. These are happening more at an organizational level. So going to look at these three impacts. So it's actually just pay rather than benefits. So it's sort of merged in the question: clarity of what you have to do and the organizational size. So the first one to say is that, oh, that shouldn't say happiness, friction, and flow. This is fair pay and clarity. Sorry, I forgot to change the title there. But basically, fair pay is impacting happiness at work, and clarity of what's expected of you isn't. So fair pay is as important as team relationships and learning and accomplishment, but it's less important than organizational pride, respect, appreciation, and work-life balance. So it's sitting in the middle of the variables that are impacting happiness at work. It's there. And the question is worded fair pay. So do you feel you know, given your efforts, that you feel you are paid fairly? That's not quite the question, because it includes benefits in there. But basically, it's saying, do you feel it's fair, what's going on there? So, you know, that's interesting that clarity of expectations didn't have an impact, but I'll show you later where it does have an impact. And you can also look at organizational size. So this is organizations in the UK, and you can basically see that people in smaller organizations are happier than ones in large, very large. So the inflection point there is at 250, and there it's, you know, above 10, 15. So when organizations going from very small, when they're between 10, 15, about 250, it's quite flat, and then it's dropping again. And I think that's, you know, just the scale factor, that basically the human scale, you know, of actually how many people we can interact with, that we can know. We just basically just, you know, feel more, less an individual in larger organizations, and more able to influence our work and impact it in the smaller ones. So now it's going to have a look at remote working. So remote working. So this is asking people whether you are remote working now. So 25%, 24% of people said it's impossible for me to work remotely, and another 24% don't work remotely. So when we're talking about remote work, we're talking about half of the UK working population. But you can see the number of days that people are working remotely is quite different. You know, there's 16% who are working 5 days or more at home. Yeah, so basically fully remote. And then people are spread across the bottom. In fact, if you just look if it's possible, because basically here, these people, it's not possible. So the questions I'm going to come to in a minute, they dropped out of the survey because there wasn't any point asking them, because it's impossible for them to. So this is the same data, but just looking at only the set of people that could work from home. You can see of the people that could work at home, 31% are not, 20% of them are working 5 days, and the others are in between. But that's very different than before COVID. So before COVID, 66% of people didn't work remotely. So now it's 31%. It was twice as many people, you know, didn't work remotely at all ever. And then again, you can see there were some people who were remote working 13%, and it's 20% now. So there's more full-time remote working. But there's a few people working a few days a week here, but it's a big, big difference in how we work. There's so many people now are working some days of the week at home. But when I put against how many people say they were happy for those different groups, there's not a big difference going on here. You know, yes, it seems to be slightly, you know, if you're working 3 or 4 days a week remotely, you're happier, but it's not a big difference. It's a messy data. And why would it be down for 1 day a week? I don't really understand that. So this data is really not telling us anything decisive around whether people should work remotely or not. There's a bit more alignment when I line up the data, like how many days would you like to work remotely and how many are. But even then, it's not a very clear picture. And so I was very hopeful for this module that I was like, come out with a definitive answer, but I'm afraid to say it's just a mess around remote working. And I think that means that people just have to use their common sense and ask what the right way or what is, and what works for the business and what doesn't, because there's no clear signal in the data really about what the right way to approach remote working is. So those are some of the drivers of happiness at work, but what about the impact onto actually, the successes that we want to see? One of the reasons, obviously, I'm a fan of happiness at work for its own sake, but that takes a very enlightened leader to want to do that. So I'm just working on how we can articulate what the successes are. I've talked about this a lot and decided I'm going to go for there being 7 successes of happy teams. So staff retention, talent attraction, lower stress, collaboration and creativity, more productive, more resilient, higher business value. And those are all in the literature, in the data. And I've got some data on that, but I'm going to just want to give a big statistical warning. This is cross-sectional data, which means we're not seeing it through time. And I'm going to use some self-reported perceptions and intentions, which are just by their very nature have more not error in them, because people are giving their honest judgment on it, but they have biases in there, or they're not an absolute predictor of future behavior. So first thing we can look at is intention to quit, which we ask people, how likely was it you were likely to quit your job in the next 6 months? Self-reported stress, burnout, self-reported, but I'll show you how I tried to nail it as much as possible. Days sick in the last year, and then self-report on team success. So intention to quit. So this is the relationship. So the people in the survey who said they were unhappy, 90% of them were likely or very likely to quit their jobs in the next 6 months. Whereas you can see down here, it's only 10, 15%, less than 20% here. So huge gradient on this. And I see this in the data all of the time. This is why staff retention and happiness are, it's not rocket science. I sometimes joke, I'm not going to win a Nobel Prize for this, but basically the more unhappy people are, the more likely they are to leave. And this is very backed up in our client data, where we have longitudinal data in our clients. So with this client, we looked at how happy people were in months 1 and 2. We left a gap of a month, and then we looked at whether they left in the next quarter. So this is real behavior data. People did leave, and basically you've got the same shape. You've got the same shape as you had with the other curve, which is that the unhappy here, it's like nearly 3 times as likely to leave, 2 to 3 times likely. What do we see back here? We saw much more than that. But this data, it's in one client, so it's a particular circumstance for that client. It is actually pre-COVID that we were looking at this relationship. But what's most certainly true is that unhappiness drives people to leave organizations, unsurprisingly. You can also look at stress. So this is how people, how happy they were and how much stress they were reporting. Unsurprisingly, the unhappy are reporting much more stress, but stress is reported even amongst the happy. So happiness is not the opposite of having no stress, but you're more likely to have stress and conflicts if you're in an unhappy team. So you're seeing a bit of a gradient, a bit flatter. And burnout. So this is I asked a question on burnout. I haven't written the wording of it here. I'll do in a later slide, my apologies. But basically, I defined burnout before I asked people, because I think a lot of surveys ask about burnout and they don't really explain exactly what it is. But what we're seeing here is this is asking people whether you've experienced burnout in the last year. This is only people who said they definitely had. And you see, again, it's the people that are unhappy at work who are much more likely to leave than to get burnt out. And we know that burnout is very depleting for the individual and for the team around them, as they have to cover for them and everything like that. So it's really bad experience. So you can see it's much, much lower in the teams that are happier. And sickness absence is actually all about the very unhappy. There's very, very flat amongst the others. I just asked people to estimate the number of days they'd had off sick. And you can see that it's here, this group here, that are very, that they're most likely to. There's pretty flat across here. I've seen that in other data too, that, again, it's only, so sometimes it's stress. I see this too, that it's only when they're very stressed that something happens. And I think it's only here you get sickness absence with the sort of people who are consistently unhappy at work. So that's some of the evidence I've got in the survey, but there's also other evidence outside of the survey about these things. So I've shown this in other webinars, so I won't dwell on it now, but it's a very good paper by Jean-Emmanuel Denis, George Ward, I don't know Clement Bellet, but on does happiness have an impact on productivity? What they basically looked across BT call centers, and they were measuring their happiness weekly, so looking really at the daily mood. And what they showed was that the happy operators sold 13% more than the unhappy operators. So we've got a strong relationship between happy teams and sales and productivity. There's a causal link in this. They were very carefully teased out causality. Very smart, these guys. There's data on share price. This is what I've typically used over the last 5-8 years, which is two things. One is from a guy called Alex Edmonds at London Business School, wrote a good book called Grow the Pie. The other is Glassdoor themselves. This is looking at the S&P 500, and this is people that have got in the best place to work in Glassdoor's best place to work, which is different than great place to work. It's based on Glassdoor scores. And you can basically see that share price was massively growing much higher for the ones, but you can see the data from 2008 to 2014. So I'm going to show you a very dodgy graph in a minute, because it's me literally photoing screenshotting from an online presentation, and it hasn't been released. This data is coming out at the end of this month. It's by Jean-Emmanuel Denis and George Ward again, but this data is basically showing here, these are the ones who have got the highest scores on happiness at work, and these are other share prices. And what you can basically see they're showing is that at the end of a year, the ones who are in the happier organizations were massively outperforming the ones. So there's the Nasdaq 100, which is that's the lower one down here. I know it's very, very sketchy. I'll have a better version of this soon when they release the paper. I asked for an early release, but they haven't sent it me yet. Anyway, the tech shares are right down here, but the happiest organizations up here. So in a bull market, when the whole market was rising, they rose more. In a bear market here, they sort of followed the market. In a volatile market, they're doing a lot better. That is ultimately how you'll measure whether organizations should take happiness seriously, because if it goes into the firm performance, then it's excellent. They did these other graphs here, which again are sketchy because I've screen grabbed it, but they were showing that the firm value, the return on assets, and the profits, again, were all related to the underlying happiness of the organization. So a lot of strong evidence that happiness is actually leading it. And this is all the work of Jean-Emmanuel Denis. I'm a big fan of his. He is professor at London Business School, co-author of the World Happiness Report. He's absolutely a rising star, and he does such technically precise work. That's how he can do that BT study, which has taken them 6 years, I think, to get to publication, because they're trying to tease out causality. They kept on getting referred back by peer reviews. They kept on answering their questions, and they've got it through to publication. It's quite hard to get publication around happiness at work at the moment. People are still quite skeptical about it. But this guy is doing great work on it, and doing it. So he's producing lots of evidence. So really, this sort of comes together in, like, if we know all this stuff, we know there's a lot of mess in the data. We know that that there's a lot of pressure out there in the world, that basically the pandemic has undermined mental health and happiness across the whole population. Happiness at work is variable. There's some bits that are getting better, some that are getting worse. But if we really want to create an approach, then we need a sort of methodology to do that. And I often think about happiness and performance as being interlinked. So these are what I would call great teams, that they're high performing and they're happy. These are miserable teams down here. But because you've created a crosstab, you can think about what the others are. Are they slacking? Are they burning out teams? And one of the things that really happens is that when I present CEOs or whatever, they're all worried that if they promote happiness, teams aren't going to work hard. And so that's their concern. Whereas actually, normally their problem is down here. But being as I had this survey, I was able to actually start thinking, well, how many people are in these quadrants? How big a problem is slacking teams? How big a problem is burning out teams? So the first thing I did was I asked people, how successful do you think your team is? And so this is stretching what you can do in a self-report survey, okay? I try to be as specific as I can, successful in terms of meeting business goals or other appropriate targets. I have previously tried in surveys to ask people how good you think you are at your work, but everyone just goes, yay, I'm good. So by putting the team in it, gives some people some psychological distance from it. And so this is actually a really nice distribution. That's, you want to see a skewed normal distribution. We normally find on these 1 to 5 scales that people tend to respond 4 as the median. That tends to be it. So this is actually pretty good. Okay, we've still got 75% of people saying their team's successful, but we've got 26% of people that are saying it's only okay or not. So that's a good split, okay? And what that's the split I'm going to do here with the data. And basically, it comes out that 56% of people are identified as being happy and in a high-performing team, 19% in miserable, only 7% are in slacking, and 19% are in burning out teams. So there's basically nearly 3 times as many people in this group as there are there. If people are happy, you know, they're sort of, whatever it is, 8 times more likely to be in a high-performing team than a low-performing team. So whilst you need to watch out for slacking teams, the biggest problem is down here is the burning out and the miserable teams, much bigger than over here. And that's interesting. And actually, you know, but we can actually check whether I'm right, whether the people are burning out, because I've got data on burnout. And pretty much, yes, actually people are burning out in the miserable teams too, but they're burning out down here much more than they are in the happy teams and the slacking teams. So if burnout is a problem in your organization or something you're concerned about, then, you know, happiness is one of the ways to think about it in a sort of more generic way. And ultimately, the only way to build sustainable high performance is to be in this quadrant, because you're not only going to have people burning out, but you're going to have them leaving in this organization. And the people in the slacking teams obviously are not high performance. They need to get them to there. So I really looked at the data and I thought about it. Well, okay, what if I define a great team as up in here? And I say that the second best option, and I'm really talking about from the business perspective, is to have burning out teams, because at least they're performing. It's not great for the people. Slacking teams is better than having totally miserable teams, but miserable teams is the worst. So I basically give 0, 1, 2, 3. What that basically means is I'm weighting in favor of success, because for success, you get 2 points, right? You get 2 points. For happiness, you only get 1 extra one. So moving from an unhappy to a happy, high-performing team, you get 1 point, whereas you get 2 points moving from a low-performing to a high-performing one. So I'm skewing in favor of success, but I can create a variable that holds great team score from 0 to 3. And then I can look at the relationship. So if you remember, we look at this correlation that fair pay to happiness at work and clarity of expectations. Well, if you look at it for great teams, clarity of expectations becomes the more important variable for predicting a great team. So it becomes more important when success is factored into the great team definition. You can also look at all of these, the 5 ways. So the 5 ways, these were their relationships to happiness at work. But if you look at them compared to great team, you start seeing that team relationships suddenly becomes really important. Working together, that becomes the most important. Organizational pride is still really important. Feedback suddenly becomes more important. So the reason we ask this balanced set of questions in our culture profile is precisely to move people to being a great team. They're all related to happiness, but they're also all related to happy and successful teams. And you can see that they balance out slightly differently when we do them that way. So that shows the importance of them all. So the drivers and successes model really captures what's going on. And the survey has showed us about that. And I'm just going to fill out with how to build happier teams and why it's a wise investment of time. And then we'll have Q&A. So this is our methodology at Friday Pulse, which is measure, meet, repeat. We have 2 cadences, a weekly check-in and a quarterly checkup. The quarterly checkup is the 5 ways. So the weekly check-in is very much like that question, like the YouGov one, how happy were you at work this week? But we also capture the friction and flow with weekly frustrations and successes, and it tracks changes in team happiness. But then, so this is actually this is just a shot of the product, but basically showing how this team have been going along okay, and then they've had a setback and they're coming back. So that's what they're doing in that team, so that the data picks up those setbacks. The meat thing is that people really need to talk about the data, because if you don't talk about your friction and flow particularly, then you're not dealing with it. You're just basically going to let the frustrations fester and become a problem. And like a retrospective in a tech team, it's basically reflecting on how you work together every week. And actually the check-in is about always knowing how your team is doing, celebrating on the positives, understanding, tackling any frustrations. I'm going to show you the return on investment in a moment. It is an investment of time. You maintain momentum by keeping going with it. So Friday Pulse works every week, and that's how trust builds. You know, it builds slowly, it's destroyed quickly. CBI case in point this week, their trust in them has totally gone. And happiness builds week by week. This is actually from a real team using the free team version of Friday Pulse, is building over a 3-month period, that basically happiness just builds and builds over time, but it takes time to build that. The quarterly slower dive is based on the 5 ways. It's the same process. It's a 5 to 10 minute questionnaire. Again, you meet, look at your 5 ways, identify areas of improvement, make changes. Again, it's building trust. So it's again, measure, meet, repeat. They're based on the 5 ways, which I've just showed you in the survey. And we have lots of reporting in the platform that allow you to track that and see it. The thing we get, the biggest pushback is time. I haven't got time to do this. You know, everyone's busy, everyone's under stress. And it's so true that people are busy and under stress. So the UK has some of the biggest time pressure across Europe. 52% of people report being under time pressure every week. 30% of UK managers work at least an extra days unpaid overtime. I'm a big fan of the 4-day week. Nice for some people just to work 5 days. The working day is extended since it, and unhappy teams, they add to time pressure. They don't take away from it. So ignoring it is actually going to make it worse. And the great thing is just as we showed, that weekly team meetings actually support better weeks for people. It's a good thing to be doing. It's basically sort of, I don't know, happiness hygiene. You know, looking after the happiness of your team every week is a really good ritual to get into. What's also interesting is that we did a little module mainly for our marketing on surveys, what type of surveys people used. The most common was, of course, an annual survey, or actually not serving at all was the most common. But for people, so there's a lot of people who don't do any surveying, and you can see they were much less likely to have a good week at work. An annual survey, 60% of people, but Pulse surveys, 70% of people had a good week last week. And actually, when you go even deeper into it, if they did a Pulse survey and they were consulting on it, it was even bigger impact on it. So measure, meet, repeat. We know it works for our clients, but everything in the data says it will work too. It's a simple methodology that people can put into practice immediately for improving the happiness at work. And my claim is that just 30 minutes a week can really help build happy and successful teams. And it breaks down. It takes 2 to 5 minutes to measure each week. Most weeks it's 2 minutes, some weeks it's 10. Meet for 20, 25 minutes a week. You basically got half an hour there in your 35, 40-hour week. The return is you've got a productivity gain of 10 to 20%. Well, that's plus an extra 3 to 4 hours if you convert that into extra hours effectively, because people are, you know, not they're focused and doing better work. Retention is better. I put 1 hour there because every time you have to recruit somebody, it's about 40 hours work. Well, if you lose one person a year that you didn't need to in your team, then that's basically an extra hour every week. And then much less stress, which doesn't necessarily translate into extra hours, but it certainly makes you happier. So the return on investment is at least 6 times that half hour. I think you can quite justify it being 15 times actually. But it's a huge return on investment for a very simple methodology that, just takes half an hour a week. So how's the pandemic impacted happiness? This is my summary. Well, I showed you the drivers, team happiness, and 7 successes model. The YouGov weekly data showed there's been a huge drop on our happiness, really quite significant on our weekly happiness. But happiness at work, a small drop. Different bits go up and down. Interest is much more important than stress for happiness. Stress is not irrelevant, just interest is more. The 5 ways, the be fair and inspire, have the biggest impacts. They all have an impact, but they're the biggest impacts. Remote work, there's such an unclear picture. I haven't got anything clear to say on it, which is disappointing, but the data is just messy, which means that it's about locally sorting it out. There's no big trends there. There's lots of supporting data for the 7 successes. I'll probably be doing future webinars on them. Now I'm articulating them clearer. And Friday Pulse just takes 30 minutes a week. So now I've got time for questions. I hope that wasn't too much data, everybody. It was a lot of data, but yeah, it was. There's so much more in it. I could probably talk for 3 hours on it. I've had quite a difficult time slimming it down. So if you'd like to post questions in the chat, I'm very happy to answer them, or Meg can put them to me if they are. So go in the Q&A or into the chat, wherever the chat is. I'm just, yeah. Each one of the last 3, oh, Roy, hi, Roy. Each one of the last 3 has been unique regarding remote hybrid challenges, and the years ahead would likely surface more challenges. Any insight particularly that likely to be impacted areas and action we can take now to prevent? So we don't know, but we're directly there. I think, Roy, I'm sure you found this too, that hybrid is here to stay. I think the cat's been let out of the bag. I think people like the autonomy of having a choice about where they work. I think that expands out into when they work. So I don't know what you've got in your organization, Roy, but quite a lot of people might want to stop at 3, pick up the children, do something in the evening. I think allowing people flexibility to work is just great. So the more autonomy we can give, the better. People still need a direction, and they still need a direction, and they and they still need to collaborate. Look at that team relationships coming in there. That really surprised me, Roy, how high that came in when I added in the success part of the teams. That team relationships really played even stronger role there. So I think we have to find ways that people collaborate and can be creative together in whatever models we're doing. You can put more in, Roy, if you want to. Mark, do you find it happier people more likely to respond to the weekly survey or the other way around? Exactly correct. Happier people more likely to respond. So basically the data I showed you on staff retention, if people don't answer, they look very similar to the very unhappy. So the most likely reason that people are not answering is because they're disengaged. The most likely reason to increase people's participation is to talk about it every week. It's what our clients that do really well with Friday Pulse really get into a rhythm of teams talking to each other every week about their data. And then that really does. So does it impact the quality data? Well, we always report on response rates, Mark, and we'll always draw attention. And in fact, the only thing I think you should incentivize, if you want to incentivize anything, is responses, because you'd much rather, or you should much rather know if something wrong is happening. You want to know about it. So it's important. So I incentivize response rates. Angela Wilkins Green, is there any data of happiness in different age groups and gender? Yes, there is. Gender differences are at the top level of happiness, very small, not much difference, but then underneath it is going on. And in fact, I have not re-looked at that with this data, and I should do, Angela. So the last time I looked at it, which was on the last benchmark survey, so a few years ago, then the gender differences, so fair pay, women were much lower for, unsurprisingly. Disappointingly, but unsurprisingly, given the gender pay gap. But also some of the decision-making influence and decisions, they were lower on. They were higher on some of the relational variables. So there was a mixed bag going on underneath the engine, but on top it was relatively similar. Age groups, we have a classic U shape in our happiness at work data, just like we do in happiness data, which is that the younger, happier, the people in middle age are the most under pressure. And when you get older, you're happier. In the work scenario, people have self-selected into jobs they enjoy. So that is slightly driving that. You've got out of work you haven't enjoyed, so you're selecting into work that you enjoy. So, but in the middle years, there's pressure, always there in the data. Claire Armstrong. Hi, Claire. How much do you estimate that Friday Pulse respondents are more happy than the working population as a whole? Yes, absolutely. So the happy week variable. So Claire, we mainly ask our clients, not every client, but most clients, we ask them on our weekly cadence. And the average score, so a score is out of 0 to 100. And we rebase it. So if you're very unhappy, you're 0. If you're very happy, you're 100, 25, 50, 75, gets a score. Our clients are averaging about 71, 72 on that scale. The UK is 63, 64. So they're significantly happier than the population. Yes. And if you are a client, Claire, I don't know if you are, then the benchmarks will be available relatively soon. And including that will be a happiness benchmark. Chelsea, considering that globally people have different backgrounds, how do you ensure the survey is applicable to different cultures around the world? There are cultural impacts on how people use response scales. So, basically at the bottom line is people answer 1 to 5 on the scale, yeah. And so we find in more introverted cultures, people tend to use 2, 3, 4 more extrovert ones, they use the whole variety. There are statistical techniques for holding for that. The effect sizes are there. They're not the most huge thing. When we look at global surveys like the World Happiness Report, we can be pretty reassured that it is stable social democracies that are top. So Finland, Switzerland, Denmark, so social democratic, look after the poor people more, less income inequality at the top. At the bottom are very unstable, civil war, war-torn countries. So there's something going on there which is getting it very right. There are some cultural impacts inside an organization. I wouldn't worry too much about it at all. The impacts like to be small, and anyway, if people, what you really want to do is bump people up the scale. So even if people are introverted, getting them to go from okay to happy is great. Obviously if they're unhappy to okay and they're introverted, that's great. So just helping to nudge people up, that's what we're really trying to do. It's as simple as that. So wherever people start from, the improvements are important, but but there definitely are challenges with comparing data from around the world. Kate, I really enjoyed that. Thank you. I noticed on some of the slides, well-being was the measure. Is this slightly different than happiness? The measure is, I flip between two myself, which is overall happiness and sometimes happy weeks for some of the things. So I tend to use the word sometimes interchangeably. If we were looking at Jean-Emmanuel Deneve's slides, he tends to use the word well-being much more than I do. His measures vary very much depending on what he's got in that survey. So he doesn't have the luxury that we do of actually always defining what the variable is that he's working with, because he's often working with other surveys. So he tends to call it well-being. Well-being slightly broader. I prefer the word happy because it's more energetic. I think it's more engaging. Also, if I asked you the question, how's your well-being been this week? Most people would struggle to know what to do with that answer. Whereas if I say how happy you were, whether you are driving a delivery vehicle or you're in the C-suite, you can answer that. So I'm very, very keen on questions that the whole population can understand. It's also, by the way, Kate, why meaning is difficult to measure, because a lot of people don't know what you mean by meaning. So happiness is very straightforward. It's an internal good, bad signal. Emotionally, I've done a webinar on this and I've been trying to write about it the last few weeks because I'm working on a book. But basically, within us as an organism, it's really important that the organism knows whether it's in a good state or not a good state. And happiness, or sometimes called core affect, is a measure of that, is basically the body's internal system for doing that. So I prefer that. Well-being is a bit, I've been a big fan of the word well-being, and when you're using it in a corporate or government way, it works better sometimes. But with Friday Pulse, I've just decided to stand happily and firmly in the ground of happiness. Debbie, although the survey may take 30 minutes a week to implement, so you're saying basically takes more than that. So basically the 30-minute one is the hygiene of dealing with the stresses and the friction and flow of weekly work, and bonding the team together. Team relationships are obviously very important for happiness and success, as we saw. And so, yes, not addressing is actually worse than asking at all. So the themes that come out of it, very much we feed back in reports to organizations about what they can do about it. We have help center articles. In fact, I'm just shooting a lot of help center videos to talk about them too. But basically, I agree with you that it's definitely worse to not do it. These are all things which are going on. These surveys just act like a mirror showing you what's happening. So you can choose to not do anything about them or do anything about them, but you're right, when you raise them, it's much better to then deal with them. Yeah, and someone's job in the organization, will need to be, happiness facilitator or well-being facilitator or head of well-being or head of team happiness or head of team experience. But basically, someone's job is obviously going to be to really look after things like a survey, but other things you're doing as well. Are there any trends according to sector? Are some sectors happier than others? Yes, they are, Sarah. So the sectors that are happiest tend to be more creative, and hospitality tends to come low. I'm sorry I didn't share that data. I'll have to look at that and think more about it. That's remiss of me. I should have put in about the different sectors, and I don't want to tell you something that isn't exactly right. So I'm struggling to give you an answer because I can't remember precisely off the top of my head. But yes, there is variance between sectors, and some sectors are under more pressure than others. So burnout is highest in education and health. But actually education is also slightly happier than you'd expect for level of household income. Sorry, I haven't given you a better answer. If you want to email me afterwards, nic@fridaypulse.com, and I will give you a better answer in an email. Apologies. Your client, Claire, great, and love it. Thank you. Roy, the hybrid model, what about the 50 interest early year-over-year reporting shows maybe it's not about a cost. Are there suggestions on healthy promotion and balancing a me versus we perspective? This is the challenge, isn't it, Roy? I think there is a real challenge here. And a lot of happiness and success go hand in hand and build on top of each other. And then you sort of come to these points. And also, I think it's worth noting that people, I think, are bad. We're bad at estimating how happy we'll be with the change. So when we were starting to come back to work, I was giving consistent advice, get people back to the office and then ask them how they experienced it. Don't ask them and don't rely on their data from before. If they're asking, before they've gone back in, they're going to say, I like it at home because they're used to it. But then they've forgotten how much they like seeing other people, and the coffee's nice and the chat's nice. And so it's finding that balance. That is the thing to do. So I think that for a lot of organizations, I think they will flip into the 1 or 2 days working at home, 3 or 4 at work. And then some organizations might do what we do, which is pretty much get rid of the office and then just meet for a team day 1 day a week. So if you're small, I think you can get rid of your facilities costs that way, which is a saving, but you need the team collaboration to do that. So I think there'll be different models that start coming out for different organizations. Got more questions. I'm aware of the time, so please just feel free to drop off and I will just continue here answering questions. So stay if you want to. Do you want to put up that survey, Meg?
Yeah, I was just about to say, I'm just going to pop up a poll. So it's just whether you've enjoyed the webinar. So just let us know, and I'll pop that up. I'll launch that now.
Yeah. Right. I have to shut that. I'll go back to answering questions while you're doing it. Cool. Kirsten, interested people aren't yet taking happiness at work seriously. They're not. I don't think. No, I think that most people aren't. Obviously, there's a bubble, and we must work with that progressive bubble. Is that because management, most organization are just unaware? It was because the obsession with productivity and growth always happens to seem as somewhat fluffy and not part of a serious conversation. I think it's all of the above, but mainly it's short-term growth. And I just think that people at the top of organizations are the type of people who are exceptionally focused on execution, because that's why they're top of the organizations. And so my hope is that by measuring it, we give them things that are familiar for them. So basically, Kirsten, my big work is really to say that, you know, happiness matters. You should measure what matters. You should measure what matters. And that metrics are the language of business. So I think it's very, they've come to understand customer satisfaction, net promoter score. They've understood that emotions sell, that they, you know, in the marketing messages, they need to move now actually understanding that people's emotional experience of work matters too. I think it's just, we're on a journey with it. I think we will win this battle hands down, Kirsten. Mark, does the survey ask the same question each week, or do you change it up to ensure so you can more easily identify changes in happiness and time? No, so you keep it the same so you can identify happiness over time. It's exactly the same every week. How happy were you at work this week? So you can get that trend. We do mix up the week with a weekly questions with a fun, silly question, just so that you people don't get totally bored of it, but also just for fun, is in we just ask a silly question so that people can bond over it, have the answers. It's actually really important we use the same question every week. Charlotte, thank you for coming. Yeah, I'm not surprised people need to go. There seemed quite a big drop between 1 to 9 people in the next size. And wonder if you have any insights on this. I don't particularly, Kate. I think that small is beautiful when it comes to happiness. Organization. So if you want to go for a sort of evolutionary perspective on that, you're with Robin Dunbar and his work on the social brain and friendships and the Dunbar number, which is that we have circles of people we interact with as a species, and sort of 5 to 15 is a really good number of people for us to feel in a group and feel part of it. When you get over 15, it slightly drops again. It definitely drops again at 150, 200 and beyond. So I think we're picking up things like that. And I just think people feel slightly less human. When you're in a small team, it works really well. So that would be my thoughts on it, without any deep insights into it. But yeah, I was quite surprised how strong it is. But it does mean that when you see something like, Google is the happiest place to work, I always know it's not true. It'll be some small team that are passionate and driven and absolutely loving what they're doing on a mission. They'll be happier. I think I've answered all those questions. So